Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're opening up a really foundational text, I think. Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America.
Absolutely. Foundational and maybe, often simplified or even misunderstood.
That's exactly why we wanted to tackle it. We're not just going to skim the surface here. We really want to dig into his core observations. These were made almost 2 centuries ago, but honestly, they feel like they could have been written yesterday. They still resonate.
They absolutely do. Almost like an alarm bell sometimes. Because when Tocqueville came to the U.S. back in the 1830s, he wasn't just writing a travel guide, though you get bits of that.
Right.
His real mission was more like, clinical, almost forensic. He was trying to dissect the relationship between two massive, often clashing forces, liberty and equality.
I think that's the perfect starting point. Understanding his mission, he's looking at America, this experiment, to figure out something that was tearing Europe apart, particularly France.
Yeah, the central question, how can a people stay free once they've become equal? That was the ghost haunting Europe. They were seeing these huge, often violent pushes for equality.
Revolutions, turmoil.
Exactly. But somehow, over in America, democracy seemed to be, not just surviving, but kind of calmly flourishing. He needed to know why. What was different?
And he gets to this foundational insight pretty quickly, doesn't he? That democracy isn't just about how you vote or what your constitution says.
Precisely. He saw it as much, much deeper than that. He called it a social state, état social in French. It's this underlying pervasive condition of equality that sinks into everything. It shapes habits, ideas, what he called more as the customs and moral attitudes of a people.
So the political structures, the laws, the government, they're almost like the tip of the iceberg, the visible result of this deeper social equality.
That's a great way to put it. The état social comes first, and the political forms follow, or at least they have to reckon with it.
And this leads him to, I think, maybe the most startling claim he makes right near the beginning, this idea about the march of equality.
Oh, yeah. Powerful stuff. He says the gradual development of equality has the sacred character of the will of God.
Which isn't just poetic language, is it? That carries enormous weight for his whole analysis.
It's huge. It's almost radical. By framing equality as this sort of divine, inevitable progression, he lifts it right out of everyday political debate. It stops being a policy you can choose or reject.
It becomes destiny.
It becomes destiny. And he concludes, quite starkly, that trying to halt this democratic tide, trying to stop equality's advance, would be like struggling against God himself.
Wow. So, okay, if equality is inevitable, if it's this unstoppable force, then his whole project shifts, right? The question isn't, should we have equality? That's settled in his view.
Exactly. The real pressing question becomes, given that equality is coming for everyone, everywhere, how do we preserve liberty? How do we design things? How do we act to make sure freedom survives?
Because liberty, unlike equality, isn't inevitable in his view. It's fragile. It's something you have to build and maintain and actively choose.
Precisely. It's an artifice, a construction. So this whole deep dive isn't just about critiquing American politics in the 1830s. It's much more existential. It's about understanding the conditions under which human freedom itself can endure when faced with this incredibly powerful drive towards sameness, towards comfort that equality brings.
Okay, so we'll get into the why. Why America? Why did this democratic experiment seem to take root there so much more successfully, at least initially, than in Europe? Tocqueville saw a really key difference in how that democratic revolution unfolded.
He did. And it connects directly back to that idea of equality's inevitable march. In Europe, he saw the democratic revolution happening, but it was messy. Incomplete. It was mostly happening in the material world, breaking down old feudal structures, changing economic relationships.
Right, the aristocracy losing its formal power, that kind of thing.
Exactly. But crucially, it hadn't fully permeated the laws, ideas, habits, and mores. You still had aristocratic ways of thinking, aristocratic habits embedded deep in the culture, even as the political system was trying to become democratic.
So it's like trying to run new software on old hardware. Constant conflict, constant friction, like you said, messy.
That's a perfect analogy. You had this new democratic principle constantly battling against these deeply entrenched older ways of being. It led to chaos, instability, revolution. But America, Tocqueville observed, was different. It was closer to a blank slate, a tabula rasa.
How so?
The people who emigrated in the 17th century, especially those coming for religious or political freedom, not just economic opportunity, they essentially performed a kind of purification ritual. They freed the principle of democracy from all those principles that it struggled against within the old societies of Europe.
So they left the old baggage behind, the aristocratic ideas, the feudal hierarchy.
Largely, yes. They transplanted the democratic principle alone, or at least in a much purer form. They didn't have centuries of established monarchy and aristocracy to constantly fight against internally. They could start, relatively speaking, fresh.
That makes sense. It's like they were running the experiment in a clean lab.
Exactly. And because of that purity, those European ideas about democracy, which often felt abstract, philosophical, maybe even utopian back in Europe, suddenly seemed real, concrete, and inductive in America. He could see them working, living, breathing in the real world.
He felt like he was observing democracy in its natural state.
Yes, he literally said America showed him the image of democracy itself. It was the perfect place for his forensic study.
Okay, so let's break down the key elements of that image, what he called the point of departure. First up, the physical environment. The sheer size and nature of the American continent played a huge role.
Absolutely crucial. This vast, seemingly endless, malleable territory, Tocqueville described it as this raw material that man turns and shapes as he wills. It offered possibilities that just didn't exist in the geographically constrained nations of Europe.
And this wasn't just about natural resources, was it? It had a profound political effect. You called it an escape valve earlier.
It absolutely was. Think about it. In a crowded European country, if social tensions rise, if inequality becomes unbearable, people feel trapped, there's often nowhere to go. Pressure builds up. It can lead to instability, violence, revolution.
But in America,
particularly with the push westward, there was always an outlet. If you were unhappy with your social standing, your economic position, the rules in your town, you could relatively easily pack up and head west, create a new life, start over.
So that constant possibility to diffuse social conflict, channel that restless energy outwards.
Precisely. It turned potential political radicalism into economic ambition. Go west, stake a claim, build something new. It was a safety valve that kept the system from exploding under pressure.
And this geographic factor was reinforced by the laws, especially around land and inheritance.
Yes, this is a really deep insight he had. He points out, kind of paradoxically, that the initial poverty and hardship faced by many early immigrants actually served as the best guarantees of equality.
How does that work? Because usually we associate hardship with inequality.
Well, think about what aristocracy needs to survive. It's fundamentally tied to land. Large, stable estates passed down through generations, inherited wealth. But the American context actively worked against that. First, the land itself often required constant hard work from the owner. You couldn't just be an absentee landlord easily, especially in the early days. This naturally favored smaller farms worked by the owner and their family. It discouraged the formation of a large, leisured landowning class.
So the land itself resisted aristocracy.
In a way, yes. But even more important were the laws of inheritance, particularly the practice of partible inheritance, dividing property equally among all children, rather than primogeniture, where the eldest son gets everything.
Ah, that would break up large estates over time.
Exactly. Tocqueville saw this law as acting directly on the souls of the proprietors. Even if someone managed to build up a large fortune and estate, the law ensured it would likely be fragmented within a generation or two. It systematically dismantled the economic foundation needed for a permanent hereditary aristocracy.
So geography provides the space. Inheritance laws prevent the concentration of wealth in land. It guarantees that initial state of equality keeps regenerating itself.
It makes it much harder for a rigid class structure to take root. It preserves that equality of condition.
But even with those factors, Tocqueville really zooms in on the New England model. He sees that as the real starting point, the seedbed, what was so special there.
It was this unique, and to a European like him, quite surprising combination. The spirit of religion and the spirit of liberty.
Surprising because back in Europe, especially Catholic Europe, religion was often allied with the monarchy, with the old order, an enemy of republican ideas.
Very much so. The church was often seen as fundamentally opposed to the Enlightenment and democratic liberty. But in New England, founded largely by Puritans seeking religious freedom, he saw the opposite.
Religion and liberty working together.
As allies. He was struck by how advanced the political laws were, even in the 17th century. Things like freely voting on taxes, trial by jury, holding officials accountable. These were, as he put it, very far ahead of the spirit of liberty of our age in Europe.
But these advanced political freedoms didn't lead to anarchy or chaos.
No, and Tocqueville believed religion was the key. It provided the moral framework, the self-discipline, the shared values necessary for liberty to function without society falling apart. He quotes a legislative detail summing it up. It is religion that leads to enlightenment in this specific context.
So religion provided the internal constraints, the habits of the heart that made external political freedom workable. It set the boundaries.
Exactly. It disciplined desires, fostered a sense of communal responsibility, and created a moral consensus that underpinned the political experiment. It was the invisible foundation holding up the House of Liberty.
That idea of practice, of learned habits, leads us right into the next core strength Tocqueville identified: the importance of local government. He argued quite powerfully that America's real strength wasn't in Washington, D.C. It wasn't in the federal government.
No, not primarily. It was cultivated much closer to home in the towns and counties. And to really grasp this, you need to understand a distinction he makes, which is absolutely critical, especially as a critique of his own France.
Okay, what's the distinction?
He separates governmental centralization from administrative centralization.
Governmental versus administrative, what's the difference?
Governmental centralization deals with things common to the whole nation. Think big picture, making laws that apply everywhere: foreign policy, national defense, maybe currency, stuff the central government needs to handle for the nation to function as one entity.
Got it. National interest.
Right. Administrative centralization, on the other hand, deals with the local stuff. Interests that are specific to particular places or regions. Things like running town enterprises, local policing, road maintenance, schools, the day-to-day management of community life.
Okay, so national policy versus local implementation and management. How did America stack up in his view?
He saw the U.S. as having very great governmental centralization. For its time, the federal government had significant power in its defined sphere. It could act decisively on national issues, but it had almost no administrative centralization. The central state, he said, governs and does not administer. The actual running of local affairs was left almost entirely to local hands.
I can see how that would be jarring for someone from 19th century France, where the central government had its fingers in everything, down to the smallest village.
Profoundly jarring. He describes the European traveler arriving in America and being completely bewildered by the absence of what among us we call government or administration. Things are happening, roads get built eventually, schools run, local issues are debated, but there's no visible central authority pulling the strings.
The motor is nowhere to be seen.
Exactly that phrase.
Yeah.
It's like the whole machine runs without a clear engineer in a control room. The power is dispersed, decentralized, almost invisible to someone expecting a top-down bureaucracy.
So where is that motor then, if it's not in Washington or even the state capital for many things?
It's in the localities themselves, especially in the New England town system, which he saw as the absolute archetype, the school of freedom.
The school of freedom, why that term?
Because he saw these towns as the places where Americans learned how to be free citizens. He described the New England town as fully alive, fiercely independent. It only gave up a sliver of its autonomy to the state government.
So they managed their own affairs directly.
To a remarkable degree, yes. He observed towns naming their own officials, deciding on their own local taxes, debating and settling local matters in general assemblies of citizens. It reminded him of ancient Athens, direct democracy in action, albeit on a small scale.
Okay, but why is that so vital? Why can't people just learn about freedom by, say, reading books or voting in national elections every few years? Why does this hands-on local stuff matter so much for preserving liberty in the long run?
Because it makes freedom practical. It anchors civic life near the domestic hearth, as he put it. You see, Tocqueville worried that democracy, with its emphasis on equality and individual well-being, naturally tends to pull people inward.
Towards private life. Family, business, personal comfort.
Exactly. People might become isolated, focused only on their own small circle, losing interest in public affairs. But active local government counteracts that pull. It takes those natural human drives, the desire for esteem, the need for real interests, the taste for power and notice, and channels them into the community.
So instead of wanting national fame, maybe you want to be respected as a good town selectman, or solve a local problem effectively.
Precisely. It gives people a tangible stake in the public sphere, right where they live. And crucially, it teaches them the process of self-government. They learn how to debate, compromise, make decisions collectively, respect rules and procedures.
They get accustomed to the forms without which liberty proceeds only by revolutions. They learn the rules of the game peacefully.
Yes. They develop practical ideas about their duties and their rights. It's not just abstract theory, it's lived experience. They learn firsthand that they have power, but also responsibility. This constant practice, this active participation, is the antidote to the apathy and isolation that he saw as a major threat in democratic societies.
Now, here's where I really appreciate Tocqueville's honesty. He doesn't paint this local control as perfect. He sees the downsides, right, in terms of efficiency.
Oh, absolutely. He's very clear-eyed about it. He readily admits that administration in America, because it's decentralized and often run by non-professionals or frequently changing officials, is often less stable, less enlightened, less skillful than in centralized European states.
So things might be messier, less efficient, maybe public projects are managed poorly.
Yes. He points to great examples of unconcern and of social negligence. Projects that need consistent expert attention might languish or be badly executed. Decisions might be made based on popularity rather than sound judgment. There's a definite trade-off in terms of pure administrative efficiency.
Okay, so if it's less efficient, potentially more chaotic, why is it better? What's the superior political advantage that outweighs these obvious administrative flaws?
The advantage isn't administrative, it's political. It's about the source and the amount of energy in the system. Even if the skill level is lower, the total force-driving society is 100 times greater than in Europe.
How does that work? More force, less skill?
Because the force comes from the people themselves. When citizens are actively involved in making the decisions, debating the issues, choosing the officials, and even implementing the policies in their own communities, they own it. They are invested. The government isn't some distant them, it's us.
So the power comes from the buy-in, the active participation of the governed.
Exactly. They might not pave the road as expertly as a trained engineer from Paris, but the fact that they decided to pave it, tax themselves for it, and oversaw it means they are engaged, active, self-reliant citizens. And that active engagement is the lifeblood of liberty.
So a little inefficiency is maybe the price you pay for a politically vibrant and free society.
That's Tocqueville's conclusion. He argues passionately that these local provincial institutions are not just nice-to-haves. They are essential guards for liberty in a democracy. They combat apathy, they teach self-reliance, they make citizens actively defend their local community, their holy city. Lose that local vitality, he warns, and you risk losing the capacity for freedom altogether.
Okay, so we've seen the foundations. Tocqueville admired the geography, the laws, the mores, and especially this vibrant localism. But he wasn't just the cheerleader. He was acutely aware of the dangers inherent in democracy, the ways equality itself could threaten liberty. The first big threat he flags is the tyranny of the majority.
Right. This is probably one of his most famous concepts. The danger, he argues, is that when the guiding principle of society is the sovereignty of the people, meaning the majority rules, public opinion itself can become tyrannical.
More oppressive than a king or a dictator.
In some ways, yes, because it's more pervasive and harder to fight. If everyone around you believes something, if the majority opinion is overwhelming, it creates this immense social pressure. Dissent becomes incredibly difficult, not necessarily because you'll be arrested, but because you'll be isolated. It's like a cult of the majority, where deviating from the norm makes you an outcast.
That sounds more like psychological or social tyranny than physical coercion. You're not silenced by force, but by the fear of standing alone.
Exactly. He talks about the power of common opinion providing ready-made beliefs, like a religion. It saves individuals the difficult, unbearable, and impossible obligation to decide everything each day by himself. We naturally lean on collective wisdom.
Which is usually helpful, right?
Yeah.
We can't all be experts on everything.
True. But when that reliance becomes absolute, when the pressure of all on each becomes too intense, it crushes independent thought. Freedom of mind disappears. You might outwardly conform or just stay silent because the social cost of expressing a different view is too high. Critical thinking withers under the weight of unanimous agreement.
So it's a subtle but powerful force for conformity. How did Tocqueville see the American system trying to counter this? What are the checks against this tyranny of opinion?
He saw several, but he really highlighted the role of the judicial power. He viewed the courts, and particularly the power of judges, as a crucial barrier raised by design against the omnipotence of the majority.
How so? What can judges do against overwhelming public opinion?
The key is the power of judicial review, something relatively unique to the American system at the time. A judge, when deciding a specific legal case, could refuse to apply a law if they deemed it contrary to the Constitution.
even if that law was passed by a democratically elected majority legislature.
Yes. And when a judge makes that determination, declaring a law unconstitutional in the context of a case.
What happens then? Does the law just vanish?
Not instantly for everyone, but Tocqueville argued it instantly loses part of its moral force. Its legitimacy is questioned. People start to doubt it. Even if it stays on the books for a while, the ruling creates a space for debate and reconsideration. It slows things down, gives passions a chance to cool. Eventually, he believed, the people or the legislature would likely repeal an unjust or unconstitutional law once its moral authority was undermined by the judiciary. It acts as a brake on impulsive majority action.
That's a crucial check. But you mentioned Tocqueville had an even deeper fear, something beyond this overt tyranny of the majority, something he called soft despotism.
Yes. This is really the heart of his warning, especially prominent in his second volume from 1840, where he's looking more at the long-term cultural effects of equality. His greatest dread wasn't violent revolution or a sudden clampdown. It was a slow, creeping degradation of freedom.
How would that happen?
He feared a future where citizens become so comfortable, so focused on their private well-being, that they voluntarily surrender their independence for comfort. They develop a cowardly love of present enjoyments.
Apathy, basically, checking out of public life because it's too much effort and life is pretty comfortable anyway.
Exactly. They become, in his words, impervious to these great and powerful public emotions that drive civic participation. They'd rather just follow feebly the course of their destiny than to make, if needed, a sudden and energetic effort to redress it. Why rock the boat if your material needs are met?
So the demand for equality morphs into a demand for equal comfort and security, even at the price of freedom and self-reliance.
That's the danger. People might willingly trade their autonomy for the promise of security and predictable comfort provided by a powerful, centralized state.
But wait, isn't seeking comfort just, well, human nature? Is he asking people to be superhumanly virtuous citizens all the time? That seems unrealistic.
That's the tension. He knew people naturally seek comfort. His argument wasn't against comfort itself, but that democratic societies, by their very nature emphasizing equality, material well-being, individualism, tend to amplify this tendency to a dangerous level.
Okay, so what happens when citizens collectively retreat into this comfortable private sphere? What fills the void?
The centralized state, this vast overarching administrative power. This is the soft despotism.
And what does it look like? It's not jackboots and secret police, right?
No, nothing so crude. It's much softer, more insidious. It's an omnipotent state that separates citizens from each other, keeping them isolated in their private pursuits. It doesn't need to oppress violently because it manages everything. It thinks and acts for them in the name of equality.
How does it do that?
It takes upon itself the responsibility for securing their happiness, providing for their needs, managing their risks. It covers society with a network of small, complicated, minute, and uniform rules. It doesn't break wills, he said, but it softens, bends, and directs them. It quietly prepares citizens for servitude.
Like a parent managing every aspect of a child's life indefinitely, keeping them safe but dependent.
Exactly. He uses the metaphor of a shepherd and his flock. The state becomes this immense tutelary power that watches over citizens, ensuring their gratification, but also keeping them in a state of perpetual childhood. They remain timid and industrious animals under its guidance.
And this undermines all those local institutions you mentioned earlier.
Completely. It draws all power upwards, eliminating those intermediate centers of resistance like towns and voluntary associations. All that's left is the isolated individual or individuals as an entire group, facing this enormous, seemingly benevolent, but ultimately suffocating bureaucracy.
And the end result isn't necessarily misery, but stagnation.
That's the ultimate fear, that democracy under this soft despotism becomes too invariably fixed in the same institutions, the same prejudices, the same mores. Human progress halts. Society becomes comfortable, stable, predictable, and dead. Liberty vanishes not with a dramatic struggle, but with a quiet sigh of collective contentment and dependency.
So we've explored the structures, laws, geography, local government, and the threats tyranny of the majority, soft despotism. But Tocqueville knew that wasn't the whole story. He understood that societies, especially free ones, don't run on structures alone. They need a deeper foundation, what he called the mores, the habits of the heart, the moral culture.
Absolutely. This is where his analysis goes beyond political science into something more like social psychology or sociology. He argued that the stability and liberty he observed in America rested fundamentally on an unseen moral foundation.
And a huge part of that foundation, perhaps surprisingly for a European observer at the time, was religion.
Yes, his observations on religion are crucial. He saw it as the essential counterweight to some of the potentially negative tendencies of democracy. Specifically, he thought religion thwarted the harmful effects of the unlimited desire for money and the overwhelming focus on material well-being that equality tended to foster.
How did it do that? By providing a different set of values, a longer perspective.
Exactly. It introduced moral considerations beyond pure self-interest. It encouraged discipline, honesty, concern for others, a sense of obligation beyond the material world. It provided, as you said earlier, kind of moral scaffolding that prevented the intense energy of democracy, which is often economic and individualistic, from just collapsing into greed, corruption, or social chaos.
And he saw religion and liberty not as enemies, like in France, but as partners.
As indispensable allies. His famous phrase is that in America, religion guided the heart while liberty guided the mind. They worked in tandem. Religion provided the moral compass, the internal self-control that made political freedom sustainable.
And crucially, he noted that religion maintained this influence because it was separate from the state, right?
Precisely. This was a key insight. Religion's power in America, he argued, came from the fact that it ruled by its own strength. It wasn't propped up by the government, nor was it seen as an arm of the state. It persuaded, it didn't coerce, it knew its influence depended on moral authority, not political power.
So the separation of church and state actually strengthened religion's social role, in his view, by keeping it pure, keeping it out of political squabbles.
He believed so. It protected its moral legitimacy, and he made another subtle but important point. Religion in America functioned much less as revealed doctrine than as common opinion.
What does that mean? Less about specific theology, more about shared values?
Kind of. It meant that regardless of specific denomination, religion provided a widely shared background consensus on basic morality, on right and wrong. This common ethical framework was essential for society trying to govern itself. Without some shared moral understanding, self-government becomes impossible. It just dissolves into conflicting interests.
Okay, so religion provides the moral backdrop. But Tocqueville also observed another key element holding American society together. Something maybe more pragmatic than high-minded religious virtue. This idea of intérêt bien entendu.
Yes, interest well understood. This is such a fascinating and, I think, realistic concept. It helps explain how a society that is diverse, individualistic, and focused on commerce can achieve cooperation without demanding heroic levels of self-sacrifice from everyone.
It's not about pure altruism, then?
Not primarily. Tocqueville saw that the logic of reason in a democratic, commercial society tended to modify basic human passions. Old-fashioned, blind egoism, just grabbing what you want, gets transformed into something more calculated. Individualism. You're still focused on yourself, but you're more aware of how you fit into the larger picture.
And pure generosity gets transformed, too.
Yes. High-minded, perhaps rare acts of selfless generosity get supplemented or even replaced by this more rational, calculated interest well understood.
So what is it exactly? How does interest well understood work?
It's essentially enlightened self-interest. People realize through reason and experience that their own long-term interests are often best served by cooperating with others, following the rules, contributing to the community, acting honestly.
So I help you not necessarily out of pure love, but because I understand that living in a cooperative, functional society where people help each other ultimately benefits me.
That's the core idea. When an American farmer helps build a local school, or a merchant joins a civic association to improve the town harbor, they might not be acting solely out of saintly virtue. They understand, consciously or unconsciously, that good schools, good infrastructure, a thriving community, these things are good for their own property values, their own business, their own family's future.
It's self-interest, but with a longer view, a more social view.
Exactly. It aligns personal advantage with the public good, at least to some extent. It's a pragmatic mechanism for social cohesion built on calculation rather than demanding constant virtue. Tocqueville put it bluntly. Interest, there is the secret. It's what held this diverse, mobile, competitive society together. Not ancient traditions or deep loyalties, but a shared understanding of mutual benefit.
But doesn't that feel a bit fragile? If society is held together by calculation, what happens if the calculation changes? What if people decide that withdrawing from public life, focusing only on themselves, is actually in their best short-term interest?
That is precisely the fragility. That's the constant risk. Tocqueville knew this wasn't a perfect or permanent solution. He ultimately concluded that freedom cannot, in the long run, survive on laws and rational calculation alone. It still depends on the virtue and participation of the people. There needs to be some genuine commitment to the public good, some willingness to act beyond narrow self-interest.
So interest, well understood, can only take you so far.
It's a useful mechanism, but maybe not sufficient on its own. If that deeper sentiment of liberty, that spark, that willingness to sometimes sacrifice comfort or immediate gain for the sake of freedom and self-government, if that disappears entirely, then, Tocqueville argued, it must be created artificially, through what he called political art. Leaders and citizens have to consciously design and maintain institutions like those vital local governments, like voluntary associations that force people to interact, to cooperate, to think beyond themselves. Institutions that keep civic passions alive and steer people away from those purely private, small, solitary, and sterile movements that pave the road to soft despotism.
So freedom isn't natural. It has to be constantly taught, practiced, and reinforced through the right kinds of institutions and habits.
That's the inescapable conclusion. The natural drift, especially in an egalitarian society, is towards comfort, dependency, and the private sphere. Liberty requires constant effort, constant vigilance, constant practice, or it simply fades away.
You know, digging into Tocqueville like this, it really does feel like holding up a mirror. His analysis from nearly 200 years ago forces us to look at ourselves, at our own societies today.
It really does. The core tension he identified is still right there, isn't it? Equality, that powerful, perhaps inevitable force, driving towards sameness and comfort, and liberty, this fragile, demanding artifice that requires constant effort and attention.
And his prescription, if you can call it that, seems clear. The health of a democracy, its ability to remain free, ultimately depends on its citizens, on them being active, engaged, morally aware, and self-reliant.
Yes, not just voters, but active participants, especially at the local level, where those habits of freedom are learned and practiced. If citizens check out, if they retreat into that purely private pursuit of what he called the cowardly love of present enjoyments,
they create the vacuum that the centralized paternalistic state rushes in to fill. They essentially invite that soft despotism by abdicating their own sovereignty, trading freedom for managed comfort.
it's an exchange he feared they would make willingly, almost unconsciously.
So, Democracy in America isn't just a historical document. It's a perpetual diagnostic tool. It shows us the foundations of a free society, but maybe more importantly, it highlights exactly what we stand to lose and how easily it can be lost, often not through dramatic crisis, but through quiet apathy.
And that leaves us, and you listening, with the same enduring challenge that Tocqueville posed. In a world where comfort and a certain level of equality often seem guaranteed, or at least are the primary goals, where does the courage for liberty come from?
That willingness he talked about to make, if needed, a sudden and energetic effort to redress the course of destiny, to prioritize freedom even when it's difficult or uncomfortable.
Does that political courage still exist? Or have we become too comfortable? Tocqueville saw it starkly. It is much more difficult to live free than to vegetate in slavery, even a comfortable, well-managed slavery.
That choice between the demanding work of freedom and the easy allure of comfortable servitude seems to be the fundamental, ongoing test for any democratic society. A test Tocqueville saw clearly, and one that continues today. Well, that's about all the time we have. You've been listening to The Deep Dive from Wake Up and Smell the Freedom, where ideas percolate. Thanks for joining us as we continue to explore the ideas that shape liberty and continue to shape us today. Remember, the pursuit of liberty begins with understanding, and understanding begins with asking the right questions. Until next time.
Bye-bye.